Good morning. Welcome, everyone. We're going to start off in around about a minute's time. So it gives an opportunity for people to get back from their preferred coffee shop before they charge their glasses of water and coffee to their heart's content. I mean, if you do have a question for either Martin or Adrian, please do post that in the chat. That's option number one. Option number two is that you can post it confidentially in the Q&A proposition, which we've got at the top of the screen. It's denoted by the two speech bubbles there. So click on that, click on anonymous or anonymize your question, and you get to be at the front of the queue. We were talking about school earlier in our discussion. So you get to be the teacher's pet here by getting your question answered first on this webinar there. So yeah, two options available for you to go. Lots of people have registered for this webinar. So we will endeavour to answer your questions as we go through, but if we can't, we're going to take that offline if that's okay. And we'll answer that within the forthcoming week. A PDF version of the slides will be made available to you alongside a recording as well of this webinar. Great, let's get started then. Yeah, welcome to this joint Aptium and Elephants Don't Forget webinar where we discuss with subject matter experts what basically keeps you up at night as a regulated firm, and delighted that so many of you decided to engage and to jump in on this topic. It doesn't happen without your interaction, so we're grateful for the interactions there, and delighted to welcome Martin, who is a newbie to our webinar channel, but most welcome Martin from Aptium there, and also our erstwhile panelist there, Adrian Harvey, CEO of Elephants Don't Forget. And there are pretty happy little faces there for you to see. And there, just to reiterate what we're going to be covering off in terms of like housekeeping. Yes, we ask a lot of polls, questions there that enables us to actually get an understanding of where you're tracking, and it's a sentiment analysis that really helps Martin and Adrian steer the conversation towards what you want to discuss and basically what keeps you up at night. We'll also sending a recording of the slides as well as the webinar to you straight away. You get the opportunity as well to subscribe to Aptium's great content on complaint handling alongside Adrian's thoughts on podcast webinars as well as blogs on all things consumer duty there. So I encourage you at the end to check that box so you can engage with our thought leadership. And again, inviting you throughout this webinar to submit your questions here. Unlike question time or any panelists on politics panelists, there, we're not going to be talking over each other there. We're going to be inviting you to actually participate in the conversation there. But we are going to be covering off 4 topic areas. We'll be avoiding complaint handling around football and the national team for a second. I don't think that might be appropriate for this discussion, but we'll be talking about demonstrating to the FCA how your firm identifies and addresses RCA and causes of poor outcomes, consistently identifying and supporting vulnerable customers. I know that's a key focus of the regulator, and importantly, ensuring your board that you've actually got it right first time and having that embedded early warning system to resolve customer concerns there, as well as actually underpinning all of this, ensuring that your organization had the skills and the competence within your complaint handling department to actually deliver good customer outcomes there. So over to you. It's a great opportunity we find with polls to actually make sure that we understand what you are talking about and what you want to know about. So we just asked this question, which is posted on your screen now. How effective is your complaints operations in? And we've given you 4 options there: resolving customer issues, tracking and reporting vulnerability, preventing expensive remediation, and also number 4, preventing regulatory breaches and providing clear evidence. And so Martin, a lot to cover off in this webinar, but here's a question for you. Under consumer duty, are firms struggling to meet regulatory expectations as well as customer expectations?
Yeah, I think there's a scale here, and I think in certain areas, yes, they are, and it's to be expected. I think because although Consumer Duty came in last year, I think there's a lot of data that's still being pulled together and analysed and trended. That means that there are still some gaps where organisations aren't meeting all of those customer needs. Probably vulnerability being one of the key ones. I think one of the other things that businesses haven't kind of nailed completely is the data that it submits to, its exec committees, its boards as well. How do I give them the right information, the right level of granularity, so that they can spot issues and make the right decisions that actually balances the commercials of the business and the outcomes of the customer as well. So I think all of those things are going to be refined over time as people look at that data, analyze outcomes, and learn from that.
I can't help feeling, Adrian, that complaint handling, especially under the spotlight of Consumer Duty, this is where it really gets real, isn't it?
Yes, I think it's interesting. I think you ask the questions here, and I think people only have their own lens to answer the questions, because when I see highly effective appear as many times as it does, when we get onto the feedback from the regulator, somebody's obviously not in the highly effective camp. So I think it really depends on what is your lens? What are you looking through? What do you believe is highly effective versus what does the regulator believe is highly effective? And part of this webinar, I hope, is we unpick that. And I guess if you just take away one thing from this, is my view of highly effective the same as the regulators, or is there a gap? And if so, what is it?
Martin, looking at the reports there on the screen, I hope everybody can see that. We've got not effective at all, tracking and reporting vulnerability. Is slightly effective. I think the biggest slightly effective is preventing expensive remediation. We talked about that in the prep meeting, as well as Adrian, tracking and reporting vulnerable customers. Are those the issues that are keeping your clients up at night?
Yeah, definitely. We're talking to a lot of customers about remediation at the moment. I think that there's an awareness that they're going to need to be doing more of it. Some of it is quite visible at the moment, and the regulator has really pointed out some clear examples of where organizations need to address certain things. Other things are coming out, again, like I said, through their kind of data analysis as well. But they don't seem organizations aren't fully prepared for that. I think there's a lot of reliance on old processes that worked when you weren't doing this at scale. And I think there's a realization that we're going to have to be doing this at scale a lot more, and so we're going to need more robust processes, systems, and training to be able to first of all identify this stuff, and B, actually effectively and efficiently actually remediate this and put customers back into the place that they should have been beforehand.
Yeah, I would agree with that. In terms of Adrian, when you look at the results there, do you think that it is favourable? Do you think that there's optimism there on our attendees' behalf, or do you think that that's reasonable when you're talking to customers?
It's probably a reasonable reflection. I think at the end of the day, we're gonna unpick some of this in terms of where I think the greatest challenges lie. And I think from my point of view, you have to be able to identify the complaint in the first place to have a great process. And right. in a lot, Martin and I've been talking about this. If you think about a process flow, that's a starting point. So we'll come on to that.
Yeah. Second question that we'd love to get your feedback on is how confident and capable are your frontline staff in understanding primary reasons for complaints, knowing how to respond to complaints, as Adrian said, being able to investigate the complaints, learning how to appropriately respond to a range of situations, and implementing and reviewing your complaint handling process. Is there an honesty lens that firms under Consumer Duty, Adrian, now undertake to looking at their complaints handling staff training now more than ever? Is that lens firmly fixed on not only what we train, but how we train?
We were at a conference last week, and we were looking at the role of competence as a result of digital first programs that a lot of firms in the sector have introduced. And the fact that because a lot of the, if you like, the clutter the easy traffic has been removed from frontline staff's workflow, we end up with, by default, the more complicated, perhaps detrimental type interactions with customers. And I think the feedback we're getting from conferences like Customer Experience in the Financial Services sector last week was firms are struggling. What was done before it perhaps isn't good enough, and I don't think that's just voice of the customer or voice of the supplier. I also think it's voice of the regulator. So I think generally speaking, everyone understands that complaints are an obvious red flag. I think everyone, from the people I speak with, firms are trying hard. This is not something they just kicked into the long grass. They're trying hard. They know it's an issue on the radar. And I think to varying degrees, and this poll it would indicate that this is not straight through the post, right? But firms are struggling.
And then when you see that, I think if you look at slightly confident, then learning how to respond appropriately to situations, to a range of situations, and then perhaps looking at that, understanding the primary reasons for complaints and using staff to improve your business, Martin. That's critical, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one area where, I do see some businesses struggling, and they're actually sort of changing their operating models around this as well. They recognize that it's hard, through the fact that they've got either struggles to recruit people, got large numbers of sort of attrition. It's sometimes hard to build that capability kind of into the front line and sort of maintain that. So there are more and more organizations that are building these sort of specialized, centralized teams in order to handle some of the stuff, because there's a recognition that this is really hard to do in the front line without the proper resources to support that.
Can I just build on that, Martin? I think that, so the bit that resonates with me is point 3. Yeah. So the specialist complaints handling teams, I would expect them, to be honest, I would expect to see a large, completely confident segment in there of those firms being able to investigate complaints. I and Martin, in our planning, we believe the bigger part of the problem is pre that. It is the identification, it is the management of the customer and that interaction before perhaps it gets to a specialist complaints team that firms are struggling more with.
Yeah. And we discussed, didn't we, building up to this, as this is kind of, it's one of the things that actually impacts the volume of complaints that are recorded and reported. It's does the business fully understand and can it translate the identification of complaints, and can it land that well with its frontline staff so that they can actually accurately identify, record, and get it into the process?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things is that when you look at the FCA's recent complaints data publication, and for those of you who don't know, this is composed of submissions from approximately 290 firms and regulated firms posting either 500 or more complaints there within a 6-month period. And the story is positively going in the right direction in terms like firms are improving their responses to complaints and actually managing that in the framework that the regulator expects you to. But Martin, there's the devil is in the detail, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that there's some good overall trends, but there are some things in there that you see that you kind of sort of not so happy with. So high up holes, for example, it's just the organizations need to be asking them the questions, kind of, why is that? I think there were some good answers. I know that some organizations have really re-looked at what they're categorizing as complaints and stripped some things out. I know some organizations have addressed some root causes that were long-standing but have been fixed because they're looking through a lens of consumer duty. So they've stripped those out. So that's, of course, going to have an impact on the overall data. But there's still, Lisa, the fact you've still got to ask yourself the question, why are we upholding so many complaints? Why have those customers had to complain in the first place in order to get the outcome that they deserve? And and I think there's different sectors that are experiencing challenges around that. So some of the simpler products and some of the simpler services have got that not too bad. But if you're selling a more complex product, then you're more likely to be in a situation, it seems, where you're struggling to get those better outcomes in your complaint handling than perhaps some of your other peers are.
There's a time lag, Adrian, between expectations of the regulator implementing consumer duty and that actually seeping through the business. I would suggest that sometimes that's a cultural issue, isn't it, as well as rather than just a systems and process issue.
Yes, consumer duty for me is about culture, and as we say on these webinars, it's a journey. So I take comfort from the fact the regulators reporting back on this and acknowledging where improvements are occurring, right? Because I just don't see firms fixing complaints, one and done. So it's going to be a journey. So culture for me is the heart of consumer duty. It is about putting the consumer at the centre of your organisation. So yeah, I can't disagree with that.
I think it's worth just adding, well, just really quickly, just that data is some of the most important data, right? Because that's the 6 months kind of after it came into force. So if you're going to learn, I know, organizations did their gap analysis beforehand and things like that, but if you're going to learn off anything quickly, it's going to be off that data. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see if there's a step change in, when we see, H1 24. Yeah.
And the regulator is quite clear. I mean, we'll go through some of the notices that they've posted over the last year and a half on consumer duty and vulnerability. But when you're actually looking at demonstrating, it's a question, isn't it, Martin, of don't just tell me, show me. And I know that many people in the sector are hard at work, making sure that they've got their board reports by the end of the month sorted, done and dusted there. But that's just the start. It's the springboard one. What next steps? And the regulator quite rightly will be looking at your board report and saying, okay, right, yeah, you've told me this, but now show me the evidence there. How are firms meeting that expectation of addressing correctly actual harm?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, to Adrian's point around complaint handling, you've got to properly identify it in the first place, right? So you need, that skill and competency in your teams to be able to do that and actually, accurately capture those reasons and causes, as it says on there. And in the customer language as well, a customer doesn't necessarily experience a system failure. They experience not receiving something that was important to them. So we need to understand that from a customer perspective. And then it's about prioritizing your root causes. What are the things that are really driving volume? What are the things that are really driving some of the poorest outcomes for customers, and make sure you really focus on those. And then, like we say, just don't, fix the issue, fix the actual cause. I've had some really good scenarios of, organizations that have addressed root causes that have been there for some time. But like I said earlier, through the lens of consumer duty, they're making a different decision now. So, there's some good positive stuff coming out of that as well. And then you've got to track that through. You've got to track that through to your data, see that coming back into your board reports, seeing those trends actually change, and just verify that all through your MI and sort of be able to close the loop there.
Adrian, on the right-hand side, we've led with leadership on the top bullet point there. There's a reason for that, and you alluded to that in your previous answer around culture. Got to create a culture that complaint handlers thrive in that environment. And there, how do firms create that environment so that they are in a continuous improvement environment and expectation, where not only the firm feels that they're doing the right thing, but the staff feel that they are learning and being supported to do the right thing?
Wow, there's a lot there. I think it's about, confidence plays a considerable role in effective complaint management in a firm. And complaint handlers per se, most of our customers would have a specific complaints specialist team, but the vast majority of complaints start with somebody in the front line rather than a specialist complaints team. So the onus is on that, let's call it that first interaction with a frontline employee, to be excellent. And in order for that to be excellent, the organisation needs a culture whereby the individual can act, yeah, and the individual needs to be sufficiently confident of their competence to deal with that customer. And in many cases, I'm certainly thinking of me as a consumer, if on my first venting of a complaint, I get an apology and I get somebody who has empathy with me and knows what they're doing, key point, I'm immediately pacified. I'm like, okay, but you know, people screw up, firms screw up, people make mistakes, that's real life. I feel that this is probably going to get solved, so I'll gas off a little bit. I think a number of firms, I won't name any, not in the financial services sector perhaps, but a number of firms I've had misfortune to deal with, it is that first interaction and voicing of the complaint which is so poorly managed that the complaint then escalates to something that ends up as an ombudsman's complaint because the organisation hasn't followed their own complaints procedure. But essentially that comes down to the frontline individual not being sufficiently competent to do their job. In my parlance, they're throwing them under the bus, yeah, and then wondering why they get a large volume of escalated complaints.
Yeah. I'll crank the handle. Don't worry, we've got another 40 minutes on this webinar. So there'll be plenty of opportunities. And Martin, underpinned, as you see in the diagram, by the complaint handler and the organization knowing how to leverage the right and appropriate technology. And that's a key learning point, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the important word there is underpinning that you had. So, you know, I obviously work with lots of customers that use our system, but it doesn't do everything for you. You need skilled, you know, people with competence. You need processes in place. I can think back to when I delivered a complaints transformation program. We knew we needed a new system, but we got some initial pushback from the leadership because there was a worry that putting in the system was going to help everybody to think that it was fixed. We've delivered the system, so it's sorted. What we were pushed back to do is get the training right, get the culture right, you know, get the people right, get the processes right, and then build the system to underpin that and put the right, you know, governance and controls and, you know, help drive you through the right process. But the system on its own wasn't going to do it for you.
We talked about that, didn't we, Martin, in the planning about, you know, we could both think of examples from past lives, perhaps, where firms have invested in technology, yeah, and technology is the answer. Technology is part of the answer. It's undeniably part of it. And both of us operate in technology firms, right?
Yeah.
So let's not oversell it. The technology is part of the answer, but it is often down to the humans that are operating that technology and having that actual interaction with the customer that will largely determine whether this complaint is well managed or poorly managed.
Yeah, so I remember someone saying to me that you know, change is always people change. It's just whether it's with or without technology to underpin that and support that.
Gosh, I like that.
Please, you're back, Philip. We wonder where you went.
Oh, it's the weather in Blackpool. It's meant to be sunny and it's windy. Funny that. Yes. So the FCA expects firms to act even when things go wrong. Martin, what is as the spotlight focuses basically on firms to lower the expectation is to lower the risk of regulatory intervention. Firms need to really take this seriously. I've just posted in the chat notification, Dear CEO letter. I'll also post a notification of this article that you see published by the FCA on the approach to supervision earlier this year in March. But this is going to be the key focus. Yeah, where harm has been identified, what are you doing away from that? And obviously, we're seeing a lot of focus on motor finance, for example, of actually saying, how are you getting on the front foot of this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So look, I think you've got the context of complaints where, you know, a customer, at least it feels like they've experienced some harm, and then you address those kind of individual issues. But this is bigger and broader than that. This is also understanding where your non-complainant population could have been impacted and they're not aware of that as well. So this is using your data to kind of proactively identify where things have gone wrong. And again, we were talking in the prep, you know, the need to remediate customers, to spot things that have gone wrong, whether the customer's identified it or not, is nothing new. Consumer Duty didn't bring that along. That was already in existence. But what Consumer Duty has done is, I think, encouraged organizations to look at data in a different way, combine data that wasn't combined before. So you're bringing in your complaints data alongside with your operational and your commercial data as well. And through the lens of Consumer Duty, it's helping them realize that actually we're not delivering the outcomes that we should be. And the firms that are going to reduce the risk of regulatory intervention are the ones that are actually going to get ahead of that. They're going to address that, and they're going to be able to evidence that clearly to the regulator that they've done the right thing.
And in fact, Adrian, the regulator did post in that March approach to supervision that they, again, it's nothing new, as Martin said, that they'll be holding senior managers and individuals to account where they have identified actual harm. Worth reminding of senior managers of their accountability under the conduct rules, and to take reasonable steps. Reasonable steps meaning, supporting and training your staff in the appropriate way at the right time and in the right place.
Yes, I think there is an important point here that if I often relate legislation in the financial services sector to health and safety legislation, as, for example, the construction industry. And I think we need to accept that that complaints per se are not necessarily a bad thing. Yeah, so they are an indicator. They are an indicator of detriment or failure. So having complaints in itself isn't necessarily a disaster. And then what you do with those complaints, for me, is the job to be done, and for me, where the regulator is really focused. So in order to do that, you have to have staff that are sufficiently competent to accurately identify and manage the complaint. And then as an organization, you need practice and procedures to solve the root cause of that complaint. And then just take a marginal gains approach to your activities to drive complaints down, 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 down. If you can demonstrate that to the regulator, I think you're in a very, very strong place. So it's not about having no complaints, because I just don't believe that. Mm. Yeah, it's unfeasible. It's like I've got only 1% of my customers are vulnerable as per that wealth manager. So having none is unfeasible and unrealistic. Having a number that you can accurately identify and say, look, I think I've captured 99% of these really accurately. These are the learnings we've got. This is the action we've taken, and so it's a continuous improvement program.
Yep. Okay. Martin, when you look at the expectations of the regulator, we've got that on the left-hand side of this table. We've got key questions that organisations need to ask. Where would you zero in on, and from your viewpoint, that customers are perhaps challenged or more challenged by?
Yeah, I think I'll go back to the remediation point, just because it's just so topical right now. I think they're so challenged by have we got the right data to help us identify proactively where things are going wrong? Are we getting that in the right formats, in the right way to our senior leaders so that they can actually make a decision around that? And drive some activity to both correct that for the customers that have experienced that, and obviously correct the issues so that nobody experiences that in the future. So I think customers are really getting their heads around, how much of this activity are we going to have to do in the short term while we learn, and in the medium and longer term as we continue to monitor this, because to Adrian's point, you won't always get it right. So there's always going to be a level of this activity. You just going to need to feel confident you've got the right capability to identify those things and put it right quickly and get ahead of it.
Yeah, and on the screen here, we've got some key boxes and there that we've outlined. This is just a summary of what you could do and how you can act. Adrian, that like a stick of rock, you've got the wording going through the whole of that. Stick of rock. Yeah, funny that. Going through the whole of that, underpinning your approach to customer service as also a root cause analysis there. Do you find that when you're looking at training, that it is a question still of firms defaulting to e-learning and a once and done approach? as opposed to the regulator's expectation that it's continuous improvement? Or do you see that shifting over the last 12 to 18 months?
Okay, again, number of points. Yes, we do see let's call it a mentality shift in workplace competence occurring. I've nothing against e-learning, right? I think, to be honest, e-learning and video, if I want to learn something, I can go on YouTube and watch a video, and I find it quite effective. So digital or online learning isn't in itself the problem. What is the problem is that a lot of firms are measuring the wrong thing. They're measuring that an event has occurred. So Tarquin's been trained, tick the box, and get on with your work. They're not necessarily, well, in the vast majority of instances, they are not measuring whether or not that training has been learned, and that theoretical learning is then translated into in-role competence. And that is the job to be done. You need to make sure your frontline, all of your employees, are competent in role. And actually, when we ask firms, when we meet them for the first time, we often pose the question, do you measure competence in your organization? And depending on who you ask, usually it's a bum shuffle moment. They say, well, sort of. And when someone says yes, we ask them for the number. And rarely can they give me a number, because most firms know more about the performance of their photocopiers than the competence of their employees, especially at an individual employee level.
And that was reflected, I just posted that in the chat. In fact, your point was reflected in the FCA's observation that staff weren't able to handle or manage complex conversations with customers or provide, and I quote, ability to provide appropriate forbearance or advice for customers in financial difficulty. And I think that we've talked about this. They expect firms to train their staff to an appropriate level so they can support good outcomes there. So the regulators identified
sorry
that.
to interrupt you, Philip. I know a couple of attendees have raised their hand. We're really uptight against time, so if you have a query, can you put it in chat for us, and we'll attempt to respond in chat without interrupting the webinar. So I can see 2 people got their hands up. If you want to put it in chat, we'll attempt to address it, please. Go on, Philip.
Good. So basically, the regulator has flagged that there is a challenge around firms, especially frontline staff, having complex conversations there. That's clearly a training issue there, but is it a confidence issue as well?
Me?
Yep.
Yeah. I think confidence is a fundamental component of competence, isn't it? So how confident are you that you can do this? If your starting point is I'm not very confident, chances are you're going to screw it up. And in fact, in a workplace environment, it's a put your head above the parapet, as my good friend Frank Brown would refer to. Yeah, are employees willing to put themselves out there and really help the customer and acknowledge that this is a complaint, or is your culture suppressing that? Now, I'm sure most of the people on this webinar wouldn't be here if they had a culture where they deliberately suppress complaints. So I think we probably, we've got a biased audience, a positively biased audience, but there's certainly firms out there where that culture pervades. Confidence is critical. Competence and confidence is critical.
Martin, yeah, the challenges for firms, if you're not addressing the whole issue about vulnerability, then you are going to increase your chances of increasing the risk of actually creating actual harm to a significant proportion of your audience there. Talk us through how firms are addressing that and the regulators' increasing focus on that. I know that they've gone out to the market with surveys and invitations to submit data and review data on vulnerability. That's only going to intensify, isn't it, over the next few months?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a bit like what Adrian was talking about just previously, lots of training gets delivered. Whether there's reinforcement off the back of that and revisiting that, I think, is a challenge. But certainly, trying to train colleagues to identify kind of vulnerability as well. There are some system things that people are putting in place to try and also identify potential vulnerability. So, for example, in our response system, we have a vulnerability detection piece that analyzes text to identify potential vulnerability to flag that up. I know there are other systems that do the same as well. I think some of the best practice I've seen out there from some of my customers, one in particular, a large GI company, is really trying to create a single view of customer vulnerability. They really want to work on the principle of tell me once, and then the whole organization knows it. They don't have to repeat that. But I think the biggest challenge as well is understanding how that vulnerability actually has an impact in that particular scenario. So yes, there may be something that makes me vulnerable to certain situations, but bluntly, does that matter in this particular scenario? Do I actually have to take that into account as well? And I think we're kind of tying up people in knots a lot at the moment, in terms of feeling like they need to take everything into account all the time, and that's simply not the case.
Adrian, you referenced this earlier. Dear CEO letter in November of 2023, it's become infamous in wealth management, that reporting identification of little or none vulnerabilities in your population. There, parking that aside, obviously there's some good practices that the FCA has asked and expected firms to follow, and Lee, we posted that in the chat there. But critically, it's being able to ensure that regardless of the situation or circumstances, that your staff have the competency to deliver continuous to the satisfaction of the regulator, but also to the satisfaction of the firm's culture and reputation, how they're dealing with vulnerability.
Yeah, well, we did a specialist session on vulnerability not long ago, and it's a bit like complaints. The first job to be done is to identify that the individual's vulnerable. Yeah, that's actually the requirement, and then to decide whether, a bit like a complaint, and then to decide what actions to be taken. Yeah, so it does come down to competence. Do you have the competence to be able to identify that this individual is vulnerable? The king is vulnerable. Yeah, does he require any special treatment? I would suggest not. Yeah, but the key point is identifying that he's vulnerable. So, Simon Scott, I just want to call out, made a very interesting point relevant to this, the whole webinar, which is about macro conditions in the market, that are affecting complaints. So cost of living crisis, money saving expert et al. People claims management companies winding up consumers to perhaps be more vociferous in their complaining. Yes, this is a reality. This is a reality in which we operate. And I would suggest this all the more reason you need to invest to ensure that you've got the systems and processes to be able to record this information, and that your staff are sufficiently competent to manage that interaction. Because that's where it goes from DEFCON 1 to DEFCON 10, when I get, or most of us get, an inappropriate or incompetent employee fobbing us off with poor practice or procedure, just not listening to us and dealing with that complaint professionally, where it goes wrong. So Simon, I think you make a good point. Hopefully I'll acknowledge that and call you out for that. So thank you.
Martin, when we look at critical or must-have data points, especially when you're monitoring vulnerable customers, where do you pinpoint firms could be doing better, or where you see leading practices to support and enhance their approach to vulnerability?
Yeah, so I think where firms can do better is that single view of customers' vulnerability. So yes, it's their characteristics, as kind of mentioned on this slide here, but it's the so what. It's the how does that impact their capability in certain situations? How does that impact their behavior? That means that actually maybe our standard processes don't work for this individual with the way they are right now. So you need to flag that and capture that. And I think that's in all journeys. I think complaint handling is particularly important. Then we see it that sometimes it's not until a complaint is raised that a customer may fully reveal what they're going through. So it's really important to capture that and flag that at that point, so that you can then just address things appropriately and capture that sort of for the future. But yeah, all through journeys and linking that up so that you've got that single view, I think is probably one of the best ways that organizations can approach this. And just quickly on that, just keeping it up to date. like, is it real? You know, some vulnerability is transient, right? So let's not assume that Martin was having financial hardship 6 months ago, that he's having financial hardship today. You know, we should ask questions to make sure that that data is actually up to date and relevant.
Leveling up the whole team, Adrian, is going to be critical in your response to vulnerability. One agent shouldn't be responding in a different way to another, and that's another thing, especially that challenge for larger firms.
We see sort of two approaches here. One is a templated response, and I see there's a lot of chat around templates and that sort of thing. One is a templated response, which has its place, because, you know, let's face it, if you've got a templated response, you can at least control. I think as more of the simplistic stuff is removed from the workflow from the frontline agents, the likelihood of a template solving or really dealing with the issue, it becomes reduced. And that, for me, just increases the onus on the individual to have the skills to be able to ask the right questions and be allowed culturally the time to listen to what the customer's saying and then draw conclusions. So a lot of it's about judgment. You know, excuse me, Philip, are you vulnerable? Well, I think customers are getting more and more savvy. And I think if you were to ask that question, I think I might just say yes. See what happens. I'll probably get some special treatment, yeah, which might be better. So I think that's a very simplistic approach. I think the smart firms are powering up their people so that their people have the skills, yeah, the competence, the confidence, and the time to listen to what the customer is saying and then determine for themselves whether or not that customer might be vulnerable.
How do we, Martin, I mean, things haven't really changed in the vulnerability realm. It's always been an expectation over the last 3, 4, 5, 6 years and beyond to make sure you treat customers fairly here. How does a firm perhaps move it from potentially an afterthought to being complacent about this through technology and also through processes?
Yeah, it's building it into the design of your products and processes and your culture as well. So, you know, from a process perspective, you know, that can be building it into your processes, into your technology to ask those right questions that you can't avoid, you know, understanding, you know, and finding out about customers' vulnerability. You know, the training that you deliver to individuals and how you reinforce that whilst they're at the organization is going to set the tone in terms of the importance of vulnerability as well. I think culture is also influenced by, you know, what comes out from the senior leadership team. Do they care about vulnerability? Are they focused on that as well? And does that flow down sort of also? So so I think those elements are kind of sort of really important to deliver.
Point number 2 here, we've got enhanced staff competency, Adrian. I know that we've been talking about supporting frontline staff. Great. Let's not forget actually raising the level of training and competence around, especially around vulnerability, to all staff, especially people in sales and marketing, product development, product creation, as well as the board itself. I think that will be also the expectation of the consumer duty champion.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I think a few firms have fallen foul in their collections practices in regard to vulnerability, and you wonder whether or not those. I know we work with a couple of the biggest collections firms in the UK, are customers of ours, and as a specific professional collections firm, they invest it, from what I see, considerably more time, effort, and money in their ensuring their agents are super competent and really aware of vulnerability in relation to the collections process. And they do a very good job of it, I've got to say. The regulator calls them out for it. They do a very good job of it. And I think, I wonder, you know, your point about where is the training going? Where's the investment going? Is it perhaps focused a bit too narrowly? I don't know. We hear different stories from different firms.
Martin, if you said, you know, to a board, you know, how would you answer a board? You know, why should we take complaint handling? Why should we look at data and MI on this? Haven't we done this all before? What would your response be?
Yeah, so look, yes, there's things have been done before, but it's been looked at through the wrong lens at times. And I think complaints have been seen as just a volume problem, an operational cost, as opposed to an indicator of what's going wrong, and your response to those things as an indicator of the culture of your organization. You know, the FCA have been really clear that they view how people capture, identify, and resolve complaints and the outcomes that customers get as, you know, one of the indicators of the culture of a firm. So I think there's no escaping it. You know, the FCA isn't letting it go. So they're not going to kind of let it go at a senior level as well. But it's a positive as well, right? You know, it's your opportunity to spot things and fix things and correct things for customers to improve retention. So, you know, there can be commercial upside to doing this as well, as opposed to just doing the right thing and ticking the regulatory boxes.
You sat on the main board of large firms and organizations before, Adrian. Did you tear your hair out literally on lagging or leading indicators? I think we all touched our head on this phone, on this web when I said that.
Yeah, I talk about it a lot, you know, so, you know, in British Gas, we were inundated with lagging indicators. We had more data you take a stick at. The gold dust was in the lead indicators, and ensure, you know, and harvesting those lead indicators in the consistent way. And I think most C-suite individuals are starved of lead indicators, and that's what they want. And that's why my point earlier, you know, whilst I accept that complaints arise when a consumer suffers detriment, yeah, that in and of itself is an indicator. It is an indicator. It's a lag indicator, I accept, but within there will be lead indicators. Yeah, if you can analyze and break that data down, if you've got the systems and capability to do that, you can learn from it in a very effective way.
How effective, Martin, are firms' root cause analysis or approach to root cause analysis that you go into when you look at a firm and you assess where they've come from? Maybe they've made some improvements because of regulatory intervention or a new approach to the customer journey based upon consumer duty there. How is it that root cause analysis seems to still bewitch or challenge a number of firms?
Yeah. So look, first of all, I think it's important to recognize there has been a step change improvement. Probably generally, there'll be some firms that maybe haven't moved very much, but there does seem to be a step change. But if you asked everybody, you know, are you fully effective in terms of your root cause analysis? You know, I don't think many organizations would say yes. So some of the challenges are data. So are we capturing the data correctly at the front line in a way that's, you know, actually accurate and I can do something that is nice and clean? Is it granular enough to allow me to understand what's going on, but not so granular that I can't see the wood for the trees? Challenges around resourcing in terms of true root cause analysis, investigation. Have we got the right level of resources to actually spend time investigating these things? And I think there's still challenges around the governance process of identifying this stuff, actually driving change that gets implemented and tracking that change kind of coming through as well. So I think this is going to be a hot topic for quite a long time to come. So there's success stories, but I think everyone feels like there's a lot more work to do. And I think they can't always answer how much is enough.
I think that firms will be asking themselves, and maybe the regulator will be asking themselves, are you doing enough with your complaints data? And I'm just wondering how firms would respond to that.
Yeah. So so I think firms would say they're doing more with complaints data than what they were using in the past. I think one of the things as an organization that we've seen that Consumer Duty has driven is the need to get complaints data into their central data warehouses and start incorporating that and analyzing that with their other commercial and operational data. So we've seen that, you know, we've always had customers that have done that. But I think, you know, in terms of the capability that we've provided customers since Consumer Duty, that's been one of the big things. How you're then analysing that and prioritising that and taking action off the back of that, I think is then a separate challenge. And, you know, organisations will be somewhere on the scale there. But there's definitely been a step change in terms of bringing that data into focus and giving it the same level of priority as other data that you were previously, interested in.
So we've seen a step change, or you've seen a step change from siloed data, to be data that is shared and interpreted and perhaps pulled apart by different stakeholders within the organization.
Absolutely. I think complaints data in the past was analyzed by the complaints team, but actually complaints data now is being requested by decision scientists or data scientists that are looking at all of this data together to understand where the outcomes might not be right, or what are the opportunities for better commercial performance, retaining customers. How do we improve renewals by reducing the poor outcomes that customers get through complaints?
Yeah. And Adrian, there are some key questions that if you put yourself back into your position as CEO of an energy company there, what questions would you be flagging up and asking heads of complaint handling, your directors of CX, heads of compliance around your complaints data? What are the key metrics that you would be looking for, or key MI, I should say, as well?
Are we identifying them all? So I'd look at the data point and we say, I won't name the firms. Yeah, I probably have already. We get X thousand complaints in a week. What I know is that that's not all of them. So the first thing is, what percentage of the reality is that? So are we capturing them all, or are we just sweeping it under the carpet? Would be, and to what extent are we, how are we establishing whether or not we've managed that complaint at the point of contact in a positive and professional way, and that what we haven't done is just, excuse my French, piss the customer off to the point that all of those contacts have gone straight to the complaints function. They're difficult data points to get, and I would say this, but Martin's got a system that is really, really helpful, because it's all very well if you've got one operating system trying to extract that information in a meaningful way that you can take it, especially for a big firm, is very, very, very difficult. And I think it's a critical component of that. Learn, refine, go back. But your people have got to be encouraged, confident enough to gather the data and then record it. That's so often the failing in some of the firms I've worked with.
Expectation of the regulator, Martin, to you've seen it, tick box approach to board reporting, tick box approach to consumer duty, not a tick box with points of repurposing and recycling data as well. And with a data-led regulator, there is expectation from the board to have completeness and accuracy of data. I don't think that's a request that, if that came across the desk of many of the 500 people attending this webinar, should be surprised about.
No, they shouldn't be surprised about, but I think they're probably kind of wrestling with the challenges of that. So, what is the data that I'm going to provide to the board that's going to help them ask the right questions? What's the data I'm going to provide to the board that help them really identify the risks within the business? And show them, perhaps show them what we're already proactively doing around that as well. How do I balance the granularity of that data so that people who aren't in the business day in, day out can understand it, versus, well, then I've got all of this data and they just simply can't get through it all as well. So I think you have to prioritize what you're putting in front of the board at any given time, give them an opportunity to make good decisions and good challenges, or take, assurance on some of those higher points. And then at times, like, work your way down the list, because I think it's very hard to give them, the entire view kind of all of the time in a way in which they can actually process it.
So a board would say, look, there's the customer journey, but there's friction here, there are challenges here, there's a redress that needs to be made, there's the feedback loop from the front line, as Adrian said, all that has to be summarized in some shape or form, and actually say, but this is what we're doing as the firm to address that across the customer journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's that bit as well, isn't it? It's your opportunity as an organization to tell your board what you're doing already. You're not there to just go seek permission, ask for help and ask for steering. The board will obviously, challenge if it doesn't think that those actions are appropriate enough, but you should be going to them with information of, we've recognized this and this is what we're doing.
And you know what, we can't default, and we talked about data and MI, we can't default back to how we've done things pre-consumer duty, Adrian.
No, I wonder how many firms. You know, the idea that firms weren't managing complaints before consumer duty is ridiculous. Firms definitely were. It's just there is just a shift. You know, there is a shift. The expectation, the bar's raised. My favourite box on here is this tick box approach. Yeah, in the past, the regulators called it out. It's inappropriate. If you're still pursuing that sort of approach to training your people, you're going to struggle in this area in particular.
But there's a better way, isn't there, Adrian?
Yes, of course. We would say that. We would say that. So, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, somebody somebody very helpfully, I should really call them out. Who said it in the, Aaron. Yeah, I think it's, this is not a science. If this were a science, we would have a formula, yeah, to solving it. Actually, it is an art. Yeah, this complaint handling is an art. And in order to do that, you need to continually refine the competence of your people. You need to do it on an ongoing basis. You need to work and work and work. And it's, in my opinion, just like vulnerability, it's about judgment. It's about the judgment skills of the individual who's interacting with Martin at that point in time. That's a judgment call. So somebody asks the question, is it possible to identify if someone's vulnerable in one call? Yes, it is, depending on the nature of the call, obviously, yeah, but also depending on the competence of the individual and their ability to judge and listen and interpret what that customer is saying to them. So if anything, the bar's risen from the regulator, and therefore the bar has risen for the level of competence required of your employees.
On the screen, we've got a number of invitations for you to complete and to say, well, look, if you want to arrange a discovery call with Action Respond to actually see what Martin's been talking about and unpack that further with a complete solution to complaint handling challenges in your organization, tick that box. You can actually reach out to Adrian and his colleagues at Elephants Don't Forget to actually see how we can support the training competencies of your people, and also grab hold of our blogs, our webinars, podcasts, and our thought leadership there. We've got a final few seconds there, not only to collect some of the key questions that you have posed there, but also, Martin, an opportunity to summarize and say, okay, what's next for firms? You know, the key question or the exam question we asked, are you going far enough there? And I think it's fair to say that there's work in progress there. What would you allow firms to walk away with and to do and to think after this webinar?
Yeah, I think it's two things for me. It's one, use your data. You know, you will have gone through a process of gap analysis in terms of understanding whether we're gathering and sharing the right data, really analyze that and use that to drive the right action and the cultural changes that you need within your organization. But then, like we say as well, give staff the tools they need to deliver on this as well. They need training, they need support, they need reinforcement, and they need systems and processes that underpin that and don't contradict that in any way as well. So give them the tools to do the job, make it easy for them to do the things that you want them to do.
Adrian, final thoughts?
Martin, well said. I think we hear too often when we poll employees this feeling of inappropriate support. Yeah, I'm not given, it's often a question in the annual employee engagement survey. Are you given the tools and support you need to do your job? So frequently we see in firms that this scores low. And I think if there's one area I'd focus in on, it would be complaints and subset vulnerability. Are you given the tools and support you need to do that to best of your ability? And I think if you were to ask your employees that privately, I wonder how many of you would get 100% response on the positive. I think you'd see quite a lot of negative.
We've covered a lot in a very short space of time. I know that there's been lots of questions, lots of chat, lots of discussion, and Martin and Adrian will take time out over the weekend. They've convinced me. to be able to write their
Next
responses.
year, for all the questions we got there, is the largest amount of chat we've ever had, I think. So well done, everyone.
Yeah, everybody's been quite punchy about their responses. Also, a question on the screen that we've said, look, how are you going to put what Martin and Adrian have imparted to you into practice? We'll aggregate that. Thank you very much for your time on this webinar. But also, we will make sure that a PDF version of the slides will be made available to you, as well as a recording of this webinar there. And Martin, thank you very much indeed. You've done such a good job. We might invite you back.
Well, I might come back.
Right. Well done, Martin.
Thanks very much indeed. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Appreciate it, everyone. Thank you for your time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.